For this lecture, we take up chapter 10 of Tagore's My Reminiscences. This chapter is called Srikantho Babu, and the title, as you can see, is named after a person. And if you read the chapter, you'll realize that Srikantho Babu was a very, significant figure in not only in Tagore's intellectual formation, but also as someone who appreciated Tagore's early work. And by work, I don't just mean his poetry, but also remember that Tagore was a songwriter, and Srikantho Babu was his music teacher, and as such he had an incredible amount of influence on Rabindranath Tagore. And this is a chapter kind of dedicated to the memory of Srikantha Babu. So years later, maybe 30 or 40 years after Srikantha Babu had passed away, Rabindranath Tagore, while writing My Reminiscences, kinds of pays a tribute to his teacher, and this is a chapter almost entirely dedicated to the memory of Srikantha Babu. So let's move ahead with it and look at some of the excerpts. Once again, to remind you, this too is a chapter not very complicated. Rabindranath Tagore does not pass too many comments. He does not, philosophize things as such. This is mostly a chapter filled with some incidents. So he kind of reminiscences his teacher Srikantha Babu and refers to certain incidents that he recalls, right? So four or five excerpts from this chapter and we'll be done. But importantly, this is an incident filled chapter, quite eventful as such. So the first excerpt goes as follows. At this time I was blessed with a hearer like of whom I shall never get again. Now when he says at this time, remember this is in continuation of chapter 9. The previous lecture was about it, and that chapter was titled Practicing Poetry, right? And that was a time when he was still in school, and other people like the administrators of his school and some teachers of the school really took interest in this young poet, and encouraged him to write, and they even made Tagore recite poetry in school, sometimes in the highest class. So we know that Tagore was still in school, and at this time is a reference to that time. Okay, so keep that in mind as we read this chapter. So at this time I was blessed with a hearer, the like of whom I shall never get again. So Tagore says, many people have listened to me, many people have heard what I am saying, what I am singing, what I am writing, but this Srikantha Babu was like a true blessing, and no one before or since Srikantha Babu even comes close to being the hearer, the ideal hearer, right? So he kind of uh, he does use the word blessed, which should tell you that Srikantha Babu remains unparalleled in even in Tagore's life long after Srikantha Babu had passed away. So to continue, Srikantha Babu was of the old school of Persian culture and knew not a word of English. His inseparable companions were a hubble bubble at his left and a sitar on his lap, and from his throat flowed song unceasing. So, like I was telling you, he's the music teacher, and he is always accompanied by a sitar on his lap, a hubble bubble at his left, and from his throat flowed song unceasing. So, he was always singing, right? He was full of melody. Now, Srikantha Babu, I'm reading the second excerpt here, had no need to wait for a formal introduction, for none could resist the natural claims of his genial heart. Right? He was such a nice person that he never needed any introduction. Once he took us to be photographed with him in some big English photographic studio. There he was so captivated, there he so captivated the proprietor with his artless story in a jumble of Hindustani and Bengali, of how he was a poor man but badly wanted this particular photograph taken, that the man smilingly allowed him a reduced rate. So you see, he was the kind of person who could, just by talking to people, he would captivate them, right? So he had a very captivating personality, and as Tagore himself says, in the first sentence of this second excerpt, none could resist the natural claims of his genial heart. Right? So you can see how charming this person was, how nice he was. Just the manner of him, his speaking would captivate people to the point that even someone in a photography studio, and remember, this was not a time when you could click as many photos as you can. This is even this is the 19th century. Remember, late 19th century perhaps, but 19th century nonetheless, right? Photography is, not even anywhere near what it is today. So the point being that photography was quite a costly business, and nonetheless, Srikanto Babu, just by speaking to the proprietor of the photography studio, managed to get a reduced rate, right? And in fact, he didn't manage to get a reduced rate. To use Tagore's own words, the man smilingly allowed him a reduced rate. So you see, the impetus is not on Srikanto Babu winning the reduced rate, but the proprietor of the photography studio being so captivated, so moved by this man's personality, that he allowed him a reduced rate. So you see, the impetus is not on winning it, but on allowing it. Let's move now to the third excerpt. He could not bear to see anyone sorrowing or even to hear of it. So when any one of the boys wanted to torment him, they had only to read out passages from Vidyasagar's Banishment of Sita, whereat he would be greatly exercised, thrusting out his hands in protest and begging and praying of them to stop. So essentially, this paragraph tells us a little bit more about Srikanto Babu's character, and at the beginning of the paragraph, Tagore tells us that this is a human being who could not bear the sorrow, who could neither see nor even afford to hear the sorrow of someone else. So, and the boys knew it. The boys meaning, obviously you are already familiar with um, the fact that Tagore lived in a big extended family. They lived in a family where there were many kids, many children, many boys, right? So there were people of all ages, and it was a big family. So when some of the boys decided to kind of torment him, to disturb him, to mess with him a little bit, what they had to do was the simple act of reading passages from Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's Banishment of Sita, right? And this is one of the, this is a tragedy, and this is a major tragedy written in Bengali. In Bengali literature, it is one of the leading tragedies by Vidyasagar. And so Tagore says that whenever the boys wanted to, mess with Srikanto Babu, all they did was read passages from this great tragedy. And uh, Srikanto Babu was so moved. So he was, as you already know, he could not bear sorrow. And this tragedy, if you have any idea of it, I'll just give you a hint of what it is about. And as the title implies, it is about the banishment of Sita, right? Um, and it describes the lament of Sita, and as such, uh, Srikanto Babu could not bear to even listen to the sufferings of Sita, the lament um, that she's going through. So all the boys had to do was read it out to him, and soon enough, Srikanto Babu would be protesting and begging and praying, so that they would stop. Moving on, Srikanto Babu was impervious to rudeness or insolence. There was at the time a singer of some repute retained in our establishment. When the latter was the worse for liquor, he would rail at poor Srikanto Babu's singing in no very choice terms. This he would bear unflinchingly, with no attempt at retort. When at last the man's incorrigible rudeness brought about his dismissal, Srikanto Babu anxiously interceded for him. It was not he, it was the liquor, he insisted. So, once again, another instance uh, telling us more about Srikanto Babu's character. So, like I said before, this chapter is entirely dedicated to the memory of Srikanto Babu. You can think of this as an ode to someone Rabindranath Tagore very fondly remembers, right? As you know, many poets in at least in the romantic tradition, many poets write odes, right? And here Tagore is doing something similar. This is written in prose, not in verse, but nonetheless, he is remembering someone of him, of whom Tagore has very fond memories, right? And in this particular instance, the one I read to you now, it tells us that this man was never rude. Srikanta Babu could never be rude, and actually, a kind of comparison is made because in the Tagore establishment, in the Tagore household, a singer used to live. Obviously, he was, a singer of some repute was retained in their establishment, as Tagore says. So this person was sort of employed in the Tagore household for singing, and this person, this singer who was, paid to stay at the Tagore household, whenever he was drunk, he would rail at poor Srikanta Babu. Right now, railing at someone means using not very good words at that person, right? Um, so as Tagore makes it clear that this person would rail at Srikanta Babu's singing in no very choice terms. So he was critical of Srikanta Babu's singing, and Srikanta Babu would bear it unflinchingly. Right? He would never attempt any retort. He would never attack this person verbally or in any other manner, as you already know. And finally, at some point, this singer, this singer who was employed in the Tagore household, he was fired, right, because of his rude behavior. But then Srikanta Babu, he interceded for the person who was dismissed, saying that it was not he, it was the liquor who was doing what he was doing. So you see, this is more of a glimpse of Srikanta Babu's character. So, this old man was the friend alike of my father, my elder brothers, and ourselves. He was of an age with each and every one of us. So, he was kind of forever young, right? So, with a 60-year-old, he behaved like a 60-year-old man. He could as easily mingle with someone half his age or maybe one fourth his age, right? So, he was a friend to everyone. Once I had composed a hymn and had made due allusion to the trials and tribulations of this world. Srikanta Babu was convinced that my father would be overjoyed at such a perfect gem of a devotional poem. My father was hugely amused that the sorrows of the world should have so early moved his youngest son to the point of versification. So this is indeed very amusing because Tagore, he was a songwriter as a poet as much as he was a poet. And in fact, with Tagore, the line between poetry and songwriting gets blurred, right? You do not know when you have segued from poetry to music. So that is something very unique about Rabindranath Tagore. And here in this example, in this instance, he says he had composed one of these poems, and there he had made allusions. I'm sure you know what allusions are. If you don't, look up. It's a literary term and you must know it. So he had made allusions to the trials and tribulations of this world. And trials and tribulations mean obviously the sorrows of the world, right? So in this poem, he had written about the sorrows of the world, and Srikanta Babu was convinced that this was a gem. This poem was a rare piece, and even Rabindranath Tagore's father would be amused by it. And indeed, his father was amused by it. But he was more so amused by the fact that his youngest son, so early in his life, was writing about, the sorrows of life, right? So his father found that more amusing than the poem or the song itself. So, the last excerpt from this chapter, in singing, I was Srikanta Babu's favorite pupil, right? Um, he had taught me a song, No More of Vraja for me, and would drag me about to everyone's rooms and get me to sing it to them. So this song, No More of Vraja for me, is a devotional song, right? And Srikanta Babu taught him this song, taught Tagore this song, and he was so impressed by Tagore's singing that he used to take Tagore to everyone's room in the house and made them make them listen to Tagore sing. I would sing, and he would thrum an accompaniment on his sitar And when we came to the chorus, he would join in and repeat it over and over again, smiling and nodding his head at each one in turn, as if nudging them onto a more enthusiastic appreciation. So you see, Srikanto Babu's favorite pupil was Tagore, as he mentions here, and he had taught him this song, a devotional song, like I said, and he used to take him to everyone's room and make them listen to it. And not only would he make other people listen to his students' song, he would actually try to make them a part of it, like nodding at everyone, smiling at everyone, trying to nudge them into participation, right? So that was the kind of person Sri Babu was. So now, how do you treat this chapter? This chapter is, like I said, a sort of an ode written in a memory of someone, um, someone very dear to Tagore. And I have obviously chosen very few instances. There are many more instances about Srikantha Babu's dying moments and Srikantha Babu's last meeting with Tagore's father. So all of these incidents are mentioned in the chapter, but I choose not to get into those details in the lecture. I'm sure even if you haven't read the book, you are in the process of reading it, so I'm sure you'll come across those. Now, the bottom line is that Tagore, this chapter of My Reminiscences is entirely dedicated to one person, and this has not happened yet in the book. Whether it will happen in the subsequent chapters, that remains to be seen. So, I end the lecture on chapter 10 here. We'll take up the next chapter in the next lecture.